We have Mr. Moise. Mr. Moise, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
And let me echo the sentiments of all in wishing you a speedy recovery and best wishes in that. So getting back to the mandate letter, because we've gone down the bunny trail of some specific projects, it tasks you with removing internal trade barriers and reducing supply chain bottlenecks in Canada's transportation networks. And we know from discussions over the years that red tape and duplication of regulations have certainly been identified as major barriers to internal trade. And so maybe you can speak a little bit about how you're going to address that. You know, maybe specifically what are some of the hurdles you're going to reduce and plan on eliminating.
Mr. Moise, thank you very much for the question, and it's a very important part of the mandate I have as the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister. For the reasons you said, it does seem strange that there are, and every government, Liberal and Conservative government for the last 20 years, has made significant progress, but we don't seem to be able to get the final series of exemptions to the Canada Free Trade Accord that was signed 5 or 6 years ago. There are still schedules attached to that list a whole series of exemptions where different governments advance a particular reason why we can't have across the country a true free trade context. And to your point, you're absolutely right. I share entirely your connection of that issue to some of the fragility of supply chains that we've seen during COVID and certainly during some of the events of the last number of weeks. So I remain quite optimistic. My colleague François-Philippe Champagne and I have a number of provincial and territorial ministers who would be our counterparts on the internal trade file. A number of premiers have themselves kept internal trade as an area of responsibility for themselves. And I have had extremely encouraging conversations with Premier Kenney, Premier Houston, Premier Ford, a number of premiers who really want us to finally drop the last number, the remaining number of barriers. It will add immediately to the GDP of the country. It will also secure some of the supply chains. And it does seem rather bizarre that we could renegotiate a North American free trade agreement with the Trump administration in the United States, and we haven't collectively, as a federal government and provincial governments, found a way to make our own domestic market truly free. And final point, the government of Canada does not come to that conversation with clean hands, in the sense that we as a national government still have a few remaining barriers that the finance minister and I are working on eliminating. Because if we want to say to some provinces that are perhaps less enthusiastic than the ones I mentioned, the government of Canada has to be able to show that we've taken within our jurisdiction, and its financial services, its food and agri-food industries are the obvious ones that keep getting raised. So I'm enthusiastic about the progress we can make in the next few months.
So flipping back to infrastructure, because that's certainly the bulk of your responsibility, or an important part of it, and from our vantage point in the discussion today. If you look at the mandate letter, there's 24 different commitments for you to deliver on, and included in that, in addition to the interprovincial responsibilities that you've talked a little bit about with regard to internal trade, there's 4 things that have to do with leaders' debates in elections, foreign interference in elections, and participation in elections, as we've just seen under ongoing events. We had COVID, security of parliamentarians and ministers. So those are important things, that in and of themselves could take up all your time. So I guess the question is, how are we going to balance that with the importance of infrastructure? Because you've kind of been left with a department, I think, from our vantage point, that needs reorganizing. Yes, you talked about 33 projects on the go, but in a country as vast as Canada, that seems pretty paltry. So there's a lot to do, and these other things seem to be taking up perhaps too much of your time.
20 seconds, Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate our colleagues' concern. I think that all of these various issues can be managed in an effective way. I have a lot of confidence in the senior officials at the infrastructure department that I've been able to work with over the last 3 or 4 months, but also recognize that the Prime Minister left me, for example, with what had been the democratic institutions portfolio at Privy Council. So, and to your example, issues of disinformation are obviously something of huge concern, not only with what we're seeing happening in Europe, but events here in the last number of weeks. So I can be busy on a number of fronts, and the intergovernmental affairs portfolio, not only in the COVID context, but in the regular federal, provincial conversations, requires a certain amount of time. But I'm quite confident that I'll find a way to be able to do all of it.
Moise, thank you.